One city on earth has been destroyed twice, besieged 23 times, attacked 52 times, and captured or recaptured 44 times, and it's still standing, still inhabited, and still one of the most fought-over places on the planet. That city is Jerusalem, and its story is really the story of the land around it. A narrow strip between the Mediterranean and the desert that Egyptians, Israelites, Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, Arabs, Crusaders, Mamluks, Ottomans, and the British have all ruled in turn, each one leaving something behind that's still shaping the region today. This is that land story, told across 3,000 years, right up to the edge of the conflict that's still unfolding in the headlines right now. This is a heavier topic than most of what we cover, so before we go further, like and subscribe if you want to see more of this kind of careful, sourced history, and drop a comment with where you're watching from. If something in here strikes you as missing context or worth a deeper look, say so below. This is exactly the kind of history that benefits from that conversation. The earliest strong evidence of Israelite presence in this region comes from around the Late Bronze Age and Early Iron Age, roughly the 1200s to 1000s BCE, when small hill settlements begin appearing across the highlands of Canaan. According to biblical tradition, this is also the era of the United Tribes, Judges, and eventually kings, and by around 1000 BCE, a kingdom under David and later his son Solomon is said to rule the region from Jerusalem, with the first temple built as its religious center. How large and centralized that kingdom actually was is genuinely debated among archaeologists and historians. Some accounts and findings suggest a modest regional power, others argue for a more extensive kingdom, and the evidence is still being actively excavated and reinterpreted today. What isn't disputed is that Jerusalem becomes, and remains for the next 3,000 years, one of the most contested and religiously significant cities on the planet. Keep that in mind, because almost every empire we're about to cover will eventually decide this same small, resource-poor stretch of hill country is worth fighting for. The kingdom doesn't stay unified. It splits into Israel in the north and Judah in the south, and both face the same problem every small kingdom in this corridor eventually faces: bigger empires on every side. Assyria conquers the northern kingdom of Israel in 722 BCE, scattering its population in events that give rise to the legend of the 10 lost tribes. Judah survives another century and a half before Babylon conquers Jerusalem in 587 BCE, destroys the first temple, and forcibly exiles a significant portion of the population to Babylon itself. This exile becomes one of the most formative events in Jewish religious and cultural history, the moment a huge amount of Hebrew scripture is compiled and a sense of shared identity and eventual return becomes central to the religion itself. That return actually happens. When Persia conquers Babylon, Cyrus the Great, the same ruler who shows up as a central figure in the history of Iran, allows the exiled Jewish population to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple, a decision still remembered as one of the more remarkable acts of religious tolerance in the ancient world. The Second Temple is completed around 516 BCE, and Judea spends the following centuries passing between the control of Persia, then Alexander's Greek successors, before a Jewish revolt under the Maccabees briefly wins independence in the 2nd century BCE, an event still celebrated today as Hanukkah. Independence doesn't last. Rome absorbs the region in the 1st century BCE, and Judea becomes a client kingdom and later a direct Roman province, ruled at various points by local kings like Herod the Great, who expands the Second Temple into one of the ancient world's most impressive religious structures, and by Roman governors, including the Pontius Pilate who appears in the New Testament during the period Christianity's founding events take place here. Roman rule doesn't sit well with the local population. A massive Jewish revolt breaks out in 66 CE, and after years of brutal fighting, Roman forces recapture and destroy Jerusalem in 70 CE, tearing down the Second Temple so thoroughly that only a portion of its retaining wall, the Western Wall, survives to become one of Judaism's holiest sites today. A second, even larger revolt under Bar Kokhba in 132 CE ends just as badly, and afterward Rome renames the province Syria Palestina, expels much of the remaining Jewish population from Jerusalem specifically, and the center of Jewish religious and cultural life shifts decisively into diaspora communities scattered across the Mediterranean world, Mesopotamia, and eventually much further still. It would be easy to assume the story of Jewish presence in this land effectively ends here. It doesn't, and that's worth getting right. That diaspora is genuinely global and lasts nearly 2,000 years, But it's worth being clear about something the popular telling sometimes flattens. A Jewish population never fully disappears from this land during that entire span. Communities persist in cities like Jerusalem, Safed, Tiberias, and Hebron throughout the following centuries, even as the region's rulers change again and again. Byzantine Christian rule gives way to the early Islamic caliphates after the 7th century. Then Crusader states carve out a temporary Christian kingdom in the 11th and 12th centuries. Then Mamluk Egypt takes over, and finally, in 1517, the Ottoman Empire absorbs the entire region, the same empire we've covered in depth elsewhere on this channel, and holds it for exactly 400 years. For most of Ottoman rule, this corner of the empire is a quiet, sparsely populated backwater, home to a mix of Muslim, Christian, and Jewish communities living under the same broad Ottoman administrative system used across the empire. That starts changing in the late 1800s. A new political movement called Zionism emerges among European Jewish communities, driven by centuries of periodic persecution and, in the late 19th century specifically, waves of violent pogroms across the Russian Empire, arguing that Jewish safety and self-determination require a return to this specific land as a national homeland. Organized waves of Jewish immigration, known as Aliyah, begin arriving through the final decades of Ottoman rule, buying land, founding agricultural settlements, and gradually growing the Jewish population of a region that, at the time, is overwhelmingly Arab and Muslim, alongside smaller long-standing Christian and Jewish communities. Within a few decades, one global war and one specific piece of British wartime diplomacy will turn this slow demographic shift into something far more consequential. The First World War changes everything. The Ottoman Empire, having sided with Germany, is defeated and dismantled, and Britain takes control of the region under a League of Nations mandate. In 1917, in the middle of the war, the British government issues the Balfour Declaration, a public statement expressing support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, while also stating that nothing should prejudice the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities already living there, a balance that, from nearly the first year, proves extraordinarily difficult to actually maintain. Jewish immigration accelerates through the 1920s and 30s, driven further by rising anti-Semitism in Europe and eventually the catastrophe of the Holocaust, and Arab opposition to that immigration grows in parallel, culminating in a major Arab revolt against British rule between 1936 and 1939. Britain, caught between its wartime promise and the reality on the ground, sharply restricts Jewish immigration rights as the Holocaust is unfolding in Europe, a decision that remains one of the most criticized of the entire mandate period. By the end of the Second World War, with roughly 6 million European Jews murdered in the Holocaust and international sympathy for a Jewish homeland at its highest point, while Arab opposition to partition remains firm, the United Nations proposes dividing the territory into separate Jewish and Arab states in 1947. Jewish leadership accepts the plan. Arab leadership in the region and neighboring Arab states reject it, viewing partition as an unjust imposition on the Arab majority population then living there. When British forces withdraw in May 1948, Jewish leaders declare the independence of the State of Israel. War follows almost immediately, as neighboring Arab states invade alongside local Arab forces. Israel survives and expands beyond the UN's proposed borders. Depending entirely on which side of this history you're standing on, this same period is remembered as two very different things. Israelis call it the War of Independence, the founding moment of a modern Jewish state after 2,000 years of statelessness. Palestinians call this same period the Nakba, the catastrophe, during which several 100,000 Palestinian Arabs are displaced from their homes, becoming refugees whose descendants, in many cases, remain refugees still. Both of those things are true at once, and that duality sits underneath nearly everything that follows in the decades ahead. The wars don't stop there. In 1956, Israel joins Britain and France in a brief conflict with Egypt over the Suez Canal. In 1967, following rising tensions and troop mobilizations across the region, Israel launches preemptive strikes against Egypt, Jordan, and Syria in what becomes known as the Six-Day War, and in less than a week, Israel captures the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank including East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights, more than tripling the territory under its control and beginning a military occupation of Palestinian-populated territories that, in the West Bank and Gaza in particular, continues in various forms into the present day. In 1973, Egypt and Syria launch a surprise attack on the Jewish holiday of Yom Kippur, catching Israel off guard and inflicting serious early losses before Israeli forces reverse the tide. The war shocks the region enough that, in 1978, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem begin sign the Camp David Accords, brokered by the United States, leading to a full peace treaty the following year and Israel's withdrawal from the Sinai Peninsula, the first time an Arab state formally recognizes Israel. The Palestinian question, still unresolved through all of this, erupts into a sustained uprising known as the First Intifada in 1987, a wave of protests, strikes, and unrest across the occupied territories that lasts roughly 6 years and draws intense international attention to the conditions of the occupation. Out of that pressure comes the Oslo Accords in 1993, a set of agreements between Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization that include, for the first time, mutual recognition, Israel recognizing the PLO as the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, and the PLO recognizing Israel's right to exist, alongside the creation of a Palestinian Authority granted limited self-governance over parts of the West Bank and Gaza. It's the closest the two sides have ever come to a negotiated, lasting resolution. That resolution never fully arrives. The following decades bring further negotiations, further violence, a second intifada beginning in 2000, continued settlement expansion in the West Bank, and an Israeli withdrawal from Gaza in 2005, followed by years of blockade and periodic conflict after Hamas takes control there in 2007. The specific, still unfolding events of the years since then are recent enough, and contested enough, that they're better covered in their own dedicated video rather than compressed into the closing minutes of a 3,000-year story. What's worth sitting with instead is the pattern that's run through this entire history from the very beginning. This remains a small strip of land carrying an enormous weight of religious meaning, competing claims, and historical memory for multiple peoples at once, and it has been that way for longer than almost anywhere else on Earth. 3,000 years, dozens of conquerors, one small strip of land that nobody with power in this region has ever fully agreed how to share. If you want more history told with this same care, the sourcing checked and the terminology weighed on purpose, subscribe, because that's exactly what this channel is for.